Good morning. We begin today's daf, Zevachim, daf Samach Aleph. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank the Talmud Torah sponsors the month of Cheshvan. We thank Rabbi Silver for sponsoring Ulish in honor of the Rav and the month of his birthday. We and her all thank him so much for all that he does, for the family, for Klal Yisrael, and may Kadosh Baruch Hu bench you with tremendous bracha, haflacha, and health until 120 years. We also thank Steve and Terry Zinn for sponsoring all the Shuvah of the month in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert B. Zinn, Punim Tzvi Ben Chaim Zechron Lebracha, and his Punim Yartzeh, his Neshama have an Aliyah, and the family continue to have an Achama. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ayala Steinberg for sponsoring the post of continued health for Shlamas Chana Pas Stasha and for ultimate Refuah Shalem. Today's daf is daf Samach Aleph, the 61 in Masechet Zevachim. We are picking up a daf Samach Amud Beis in the middle of a discussion. So daf Samach Amud Aleph, the Gemara began with a discussion about what happens if the Mizbeach gets damaged. The Gemara started off by saying, the Gemara quotes, I'm going to quickly read a few lines from daf Samach Amud Aleph, about 6 lines from the bottom. The Gemara says, Amar B'Laz Mizbeach Shenifgam Ein Eichlin Beginei Shiarim Mencha. We know as a Davar Pasha, the obvious point is that the shiari mincha, the leftover parts of the meal offering, cannot be eaten if the mizbeach is damaged. And a few lines later, the Gemara wants to know what the halacha is with kadshe kadashim. The Gemara said 3 lines from the bottom on daf samach amud aleph. The Gemara says kadshe kadashim minala. And what's the halacha with kadshe kadashim? Like perhaps the chatas. The Gemara says that's obvious. Why? Because the pasuk says kadesh kadashim, the same exact pasuk that we learned from, that the mincha has to be eaten as long as the mizbeach is still intact. That pasuk ends off with the words kodesh kadoshim he. So therefore we know that the determining factor is that it's kodesh kadosh. And the Gemara goes on and says, what's the halacha with kachim kalev? And Aryeh answers that we learned it from a drasha. And that's where the Gemara essentially leaves off, or essentially tells us that kachim kadoshim, a mincha is obviously, yes, if the mizbeach is damaged, then you can no longer eat the shiari mincha. Kadshe kadashim is going to be included in that as well, because the same exact pasuk that says eitlam mizbeach Hashem alikecha, that's be eaten as long as the mizbeach is still intact, also ends up with kodesh kadashim. When it comes to kachim kalim, like a shlamim or carbon like that, the Gemara learns it from a drasha. The drasha we had yesterday was quoted from about these gimels that came in. This is Echad. They have the Gemara counts it as Rabbi Shmuel. What happened over there? He wants to compare Bechar, Meiser, and Bikurim. And the Gemara goes back and forth trying to figure out how you learn that drasha. But ultimately, what the Gemara came out with was that the reason why it was Pashat to Rabbi Shmuel that the Bechar needs to have the mizbeach intact, and Meiser did not. More just going to quote it inside, is because Omer Ravina, but halfway down the Yomad, Olam Kasavar Lo Kitchen, that the specific place of the Beis Hamikdash does not retain eternal kedusha. The Bechar Shnizrak Domik Karban Kaidam Korban Abayis. Bechar of Abayis. What are we talking about? We're talking about a case where the Bechar was processed properly before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. V'adayim b'sarei kayim. What's left, you still have its meat, which is kayim. So in other words, whatever point you're going to find about a Bechar that's going to make it better than Meiser, and yesterday the Gemara explained that Bechar is better than Meiser, or different than Meiser, in that it has to be processed on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara says, all right, fine, they found a scenario for you where it was properly processed before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Now the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, that doesn't bother us anymore because it already had its hakrava on the Mizbeach. The dam was sprinkled on the Mizbeach. Now the iskish bisara l'damo. What do? We make a hekesh from the meat of the leftover, the meat of the bechar, which can be eaten now, to damo. Just the Gemara says, ma damo b'mizbeach, just like it's dam is only able to be properly processed if the mizbeach is still there. We say Asaro b'mizbeach, it's basar, the leftover meat can only be eaten as long as the mizbeach is there. That's ultimately how Ravina explains what's going on over here. So you have a case where the mizbeach is no longer here, and the carbon is comparable to Meiser in that its blood is already sprinkled. So therefore, it's a davar pasha to Ravina that case is going to be different by Bechar. It's going to be obvious to Ravina, to Rabbi Shmuel, that Bechar is going to be different. But what's the bottom line? The bottom line over here is, what do we see? We see when it comes to kachim kalim like a Bechar, you have to have a mizbeach. So that this whole thing, Kedusha Rishana, Kitchel Shaita, Kitchel Asadlavo, all of that, ultimately, thank you, Maishi, all of that shows us that when it comes to Bechar, what's the halacha? It has to have a mizbeach. Now we see that when it comes to kachim kalim, you have to have a mizbeach intact, and it's not, you can't eat its meat. Now, as a side point, the Gemara says, "Asi Meiser b'alaf Bechar." We now learn Meiser from Bechar. Now the Gemara says, "V'chi davar lama b'hekesh kozim lama b'hekesh." Is this even going to work? Can you go ahead and double up on a hekesh? Can you learn an initial hekesh from the dam, the blood of the carbon, to the meat of the carbon, and then take the meat of the carbon and then apply that to Meiser? That we can't do that when it comes to kachim. We've learned previously in this Masechta, when it comes to kachim, you can't go ahead and make a double hekesh. Gemara answers and says, Meiser dagon kulun. We're talking about Meiser of grain. That's not a davar of hektish. That's not considered kachim, and therefore the problem of making a double hekesh is only relevant to kachim, and in this case it's not going to be a problem. Where it says, that's only going to be true if we go after the item that's being learned to, like Meiser. But if when we're talking about a double hekesh, we always focus on the original source of the hekesh. And we say when you have a davar, something which is kachim, you can't double the hekesh. If the starting point of that is kachim, you can't learn it to anything else. Michael Lemema, what are you going to say? And the truth is that makes a lot of sense. Because there's really two parts to this. Number one, learning dinim of kachim. Essentially, this idea that you can't have a double hekesh tells me that when you're learning dinim of kachim, to double up the hekesh is something which would you not be able to do. Why? Because kachim are unique. Kachim are not necessarily things that always follow the same level of lumdus or svara as any other type of dinim. So kachim are unique. There's different types of karbanos, different types of kachim. So to make a double hekesh, you could say, listen, Meiser is one thing, Bechar is another thing. So even if you're going to say that the meat of a Bechar can be learned from a hekesh to the dam of a Bechar, you could say, listen, when you're learning the new din, it's going to be different. But the truth is, to go after Basar Malamed, the initial point as well, Bechar is also unique. In other words, Basar Malamed, you say Bechar is unique, it got all its dinim, you used it up over there, so how do you have the right to go and double up to learn Bechar from blood to meat, and then from meat to another type of carbon? Maybe Bechar is just unique and you can't stretch it any further. The Gemara says, where it says, Dam, Ubasar Chodam Milsahi, Dam and Basar is one thing, and therefore it's not really considered to be a double hekesh. So that's where the Gemara ultimately ends off. And the Gemara learns this then. It tells us that kachim kalim, you do have to have a mizbeach. We know that from the dam of a bechar. From the dam of a bechar, we stretch it to the meat of a bechar, and then from a meat of a bechar, we stretch it to meiser. Now, how about the fact that you can't do a double hekesh? Well, the truth is, it's not really considered a double hekesh because the first time that we're comparing dam to basar, that doesn't really require all the tools of hekesh. That's just simply telling us that they're the same thing, and therefore it's one hekesh from bechar to meiser. Now the Gemara goes back to this discussion. The Gemara goes back to the original point. The original point that we learned, that when it comes to kachim kalim, you can't eat the meat if the mizbeach is damaged. Yisalik Ravin, when he left, Amr l'shmaita kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah. He came to Rabbi Yirmiyah and he told us this halacha that we learned, that kachim kalam, if the mizbeach is going to be damaged, you can't eat the meat. So what did he say? What did Rabbi Yirmiyah respond? Amar, he said, Bavloi tipshai. The foolish Babylonians. He says, I'm told the yasu ba'ara chashucha, because of the fact that you live in a dark land. What does that mean? Bavel was lower, so it was a little bit darker. And again, it was typically understood, certainly at that period of time, that in Bavel they just didn't have as much access to the Mishnayos as they had in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, again, this sounds like he's saying a very negative thing. I'm told the yasu ba'ara chashucha, amri shmaita the mechashcha. So because you live in a dark place, you're telling us dark halachas. In other words, he was using a pretty strong term to say, sorry, I disagree with you. And then he said, Lo shmiya lahu, have you not learned how the Tanya b'shas tzilik masayis kachim nisal? I'll get to this in just 1 second, but again, just to understand the lashon over here, you can either look at this as a very negative line. He's saying, all you people collectively who live in this dark land of Bavel, you have no idea what you're talking about. That's why you're making a mistake. But I think that the Gemara is really just speaking very practically. He was saying, I understand where your mistake was coming from. The reason why you made mistakes is because us in Eretz Yisrael are fortunate to have all the Mishnayos written down for us, and we have all the brises, all the teseftas over here. So therefore, when we go to yeshiva, there's nothing that's missing. We have access to every bit of information that we could possibly need, and therefore, we don't make mistakes. You in Bavel, it takes a lot more mysterious nefesh for you to learn. You don't have access to all the Mishnayos. You don't have access to all the brises. You don't have access to all the teseftas, and therefore, you're simply missing some basic information, and that's why it is that you're giving us the wrong halacha about kachim kalam. Basically, a very glorified way of disagreeing and saying, no, I disagree. Kachim kalam do not have to have mizbech in order to eat the meat. Now, what was it that he missed? He said, Lo shmiya lahu, he didn't hear Hadu Tanya, this that we learned in the Brayse that says, B'shas siluk masais, at the time that they would take apart the Mishkan, kachim nifsalim. All the kachim will become disqualified. V'zavim u'mitzeiraim mishtachim chutz mechitza. And zavim and mitzeiraim still had to stay outside of the mechitza. In other words, two different things. If you look at Rashi, it's the second line, kachim nifsalim. He says, basar kache kadashim, the meat of kache kadashim, v'kosalka daitach. What we're thinking at this point is, mipnei siluk hamizbeachu. The reason why it became disqualified is because of siluk hamizbeach. In other words, the exact halacha that we've been talking about up until now is the reason why the kachim became disqualified. Now, look at Rashi. He goes on, midikatani v'zaven u'mutzeirayim mishtachim. The fact that you're saying that someone who is tamei still needs to be sent out of the machna levia, machna shchina, and the machna Yisrael, he be sent out of all those machnas. Shein mitzera nichnas ledigle hashvatim v'loy zav lemachna levia noisei arayin. They're meaning the kaman afal pisha nasa. We'll see you on the next amud. Even though they're traveling, oyel mayidhu. Alma, Rashi says, this is the point. Nifsalin. We see that the karbanos come disqualified. The disqualification that we said, lav mishum demisli b'yotzehu, the ha'ayal mayid chashav lahu. The bottom line is as follows. When they would travel, they would take apart the Mishkan, which was the tabernacle that they would use. They'd take it apart. Now you might think the reason why the kachim become disqualified is because we know there's something called the psul yotzei. If something leaves its jurisdiction, a carbon leaves the jurisdiction it has to be in, it becomes disqualified. And you might think that once you take down the Mishkan, it's automatically going to be considered to be disqualified because it's out of the jurisdiction that it's supposed to be in. But the answer to that is no, that can't be the reason. I'll prove it to you. How can I prove it to you? Because if it was considered to be outside the jurisdiction of the Mishkan, we would then allow a zav, someone who has an impurity, or a mitzvah, someone who has leprosy, to come back in. We'd say, listen, there's no Olam Moed right now, therefore you're invited to join back in. But what's the halacha? No, he has to stay out. So what do you see? It can't be that the disqualification of these karbanos is because there's a psul yotze, because it's outside the jurisdiction or the area, the confines of that area where it's supposed to be. What's the reason why you can't eat the karbanos? It's because the mizbeach is not intact. The mizbeach was moved. Once the mizbeach was moved, you can't eat the karbanos. So that's what we see with regard to one halacha. One halacha tells us you can't eat it. The problem is, V'tanya idach, we have another verse that says, B'shnei mekomos kachim nechalim. In both places, kachim can be eaten. Now, what does both places mean? Right now, the Gemara is assuming, my love, what are these two places? Habakachim kachim, habakachim kalim. Both places means whether the mizbeach is intact or the mizbeach is not intact, you could eat the karbanos. So now we have a stira. The first brisa tells us that once the mizbeach is moving, you can't eat karbanos anymore. Second brisa tells us, yes, you can, no problem, you could eat your karbanos even though the mizbeach is moving. So we have a stira. What do we do with the fact that we have this contradiction? How do you simply answer the question without having a simple contradiction? The answer is simple. Habakachi kadashim. This is talking about kachi kadashim. Habakachim kalam. The one that says you could eat it in both places. So therefore, Rabbi said, I'm sorry to tell you, you Babylonian, you call them fools, are making a mistake because you don't have all the Mishnayos in front of you, and you do not know that there's one Mishnah that seems to clearly indicate that kachim can be eaten even though the Mizbeach was moved. The way that we simply understand that is that there's a difference, there's a distinction between kachim kadashim and kachim kalam. And therefore, you're incorrect by saying that kachim kalam cannot be eaten once the Mizbeach is moved, because we must settle the stira, the contradiction between these two brises, by saying one's talking about kachim kadashim, one's talking about kachim kalam. The Gemara ultimately says, no, that's incorrect. Like kasha. This really was not even a kasha in the first place. Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbanan. It's just simple. The reason why in one place it says that the karbanos can be eaten, one place it says it can't be eaten. The place where it says it can't be eaten is Rabbi Yishmael. And Rabbanan, this is the Rabbanan. They don't go ahead and make this dam from Basar Drasha. We just spent the beginning of this morning talking about how do you know the kachi kalim cannot be eaten if the mizbeach are damaged, because we learned dam of bachar to basar of bachar, and then basar of bachar to meiser, and ultimately that told me the halacha of kachim kalam. Well, maybe that's only the halacha according to Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael, that's the one who says you can't eat the meat, and that's including kachi kalam. The Rabbanan, the other brides is the Rabbanan who disagree. The Ibay Sema. Alternatively, you can suggest hava kachi kadashim. Both of these cases are talking about kachi kadashim. Umay b'shnei mekomos. What does it mean b'shnei mekomos? The Gemara answers kodem sheyamidu leviyim es hamishkan. One's talking about before they built the mishkan and the top of samachalach amid beis. Ula'achar shaparka leviyim hamishkan. The other one's talking about after they took it down. Now go back for a second. We didn't really get enough time to have samachalach amid aleph. It's quite a short amud. There's something that Rashi clarifies for us here, which is very important. First of all, I just should mention, I usually mention when we have a short amud like this, and you have so many words of Tosfos, that even if you're learning Daf Yomi, you're not learning all of Tosfos, this is kind of like rubbernecking. Like you see something going on the side of the highway, you have to check, like what's going on over here? Like why is there's so much Tosfos over here? So I'm learning Daf Yomi. I don't want to learn this whole Tosfos. I don't have time for it. But like at least give a little quick peek. The problem just is that this Tosfos really is hanging over yesterday's Amud on the sugya of Kedusha Rishon and Kitchel Shaita and Kitchel Lasad Lavo. And I don't want to go backwards into that sugya, so therefore I'm going to break the rule. We're not going to rubberneck on this Tosfos, but we'll be yotzi our rubbernecking by mentioning Rabbosai. There's a huge Tosfos over here. The Baalei Tosfos felt it was very important to take up a full blot of Gemara and to shorten our Daf Yomi shir today by making Daf Samach Aleph Amud Aleph only 3 lines. So yes, there's a lot to talk about in the sugya. And clearly we're missing out on it because we don't have enough time for it. But if you have time throughout the day, it will be a good idea to go look back to this fascinating sugya of Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel Shaita, Kitchel Lasad Lavo. But ultimately, we just mentioned that the way we're settling the stira is by saying one's talking about before they built the Mishkan, what's talking about after they built the Mishkan. Now, obviously, that doesn't make sense. We're talking about before they built the Mishkan. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, third line, El Echad Minayu, one of these cases are talking about is when the Mishkan is standing properly. The other one's talking about after they took apart all those beams of the, or I should say those panels of the Mishkan. Now he says, Rashi says, when the Gemara says the words, before the Levium erected the Mishkan, Denakat hacha lav davka. Doesn't mean prior to them doing this. Why? He explains, Chada lo mishkachla. You're never going to have a scenario where the Mizbeach is in its location, but the actual Mishkan is not built yet. Why? He explains, why Sharei Kodem Si Yachanu b'nei Kahas Nosei HaMizbechos Hayachonu b'nei Gershon Umerari Nosei HaMishkan Mekimenosa. If you just look at the psukim that tell us where that they traveled, those who carried the Mishkan always went ahead. So they got there first and they erected it. Now, though, by the time the Mizbeach came, it always was that the Mishkan was built. When they traveled someplace else, first they would take down the Mishkan. The Gershon, they would travel after one of those flags. Now, Bnei Kahas, Bnei Kahas they were carrying the Mizbeach, they traveled after two of the flags. So therefore, Kadeshi Kodmin Bnei Gershon Machaniyasan, Umamidin Samishkal Bnei Bo Bnei Kahas. Says Rashi, this was structured like this intentionally. They knew what they were doing. So what they did was first they took down the Mishkan, and those who carried Gershon and Merari, who were carrying the Mishkan, they went first. They took it down first, they left first, so they got there first, they erected the Mishkan and all the curtains around it, and then the Bnei Kahas showed up with the Mizbeach and put it in there. So in other words, says Rashi, you're never going to have a scenario where the Mizbeach is standing there before those who erected the Mishkan. So therefore, if you look at the Gemara, it says, what's that talking about? That's talking about when the Mishkan is standing up properly the way it's supposed to be. In other words, that's the case where you can eat it. And the other location which is mentioned is after they took down the Mishkan, but the Mizbeach is still in its place. So therefore, that's what it means, B'shnei Makomos, you could eat it. B'shnei Makomos means both when the Mishkan is fully erected in its proper form, the Mishkan is there, the curtains are there, the Mizbeach is there. The other case is when the Levim took down the Mishkan and all the curtains and left, but the Mizbeach was still there. You know why you're allowed to eat the kachim? The reason is because the Mizbeach is still there. And since the Mizbeach is still there, in both cases you can eat it. So there's no stira. None of these cases are talking about a case where the Mizbeach is not intact, and that's why you're allowed to eat it. So therefore, with due respect to Rabbi Yirmiyah, there was no mistake made on behalf of the Bnei Bavel. They were correct in saying that kachim kalam cannot be eaten with Mizbeach is taken apart. Now, it happens to be, just for intellectual honesty over here, Rashi does bring another opinion that maybe it could be talking about a case where they went out of order. In other words, it's possible they could have gotten out of order and the Bnei Kahas left early. Okay, now top of Samach Aleph Amud Beis. Now, why does the Brayta have to tell us in both of these cases that you're allowed to eat the carbon? In other words, why not? The way we just explained it, one case is talking about when the Mishkan is fully erect the way it's supposed to be. The other case is talking about a case where the Mishkan is taken down, but the Mizbeach is still there. So why would I think I can't eat the meat? The Gemara says, I would say, if solahu b'yotzei, that the carbon becomes disqualified with the psul of yotzei, as I mentioned before. Why? Because the Mishkan's not there, the curtains are not there. Kamash Malan, what the teaches is, even though the Mishkan is not there, the fact that the Mizbeach is there is enough, and therefore you're allowed to eat the carbon. Where it says, hold on, who said? Maybe it is going to be disqualified with Yotzei. Amar Kar, the Gemara answers, it says in the Pasuk, Benasa Ohel Moed. You will travel with the Ohel Moed. Now, what's it called while you're traveling? Af al pisha nasa. Even though it's all packed up, it's in the back of the truck, it's all packed up in this wagon, it's folded up, and it's stacked up in a big pile. So what's the halacha? Af al pisha nasa, Ohel Moed, who it's still considered to be an Ohel Moed, and therefore there will not be a disqualification of Yotzei, because it's still an Ohel Moed, despite the fact that it's packed up into its carriage. Gemara now goes on. Amar of Huna, to another discussion. Amar of Huna Marav. Mizbeach shel Shiloh shel Avanim Hayim. Mizbeach that was construction in Shiloh was made out of Avanim. Now it's just important just to understand what happened here. Moshe Rabbeinu built the first Mizbeach, and they used it for 14 years when the Mishkan was in Gilgal. Now, after they went into Eretz Yisrael, that was while they were conquering Eretz Yisrael. Now, after they divided the entire Eretz Yisrael, they put the Mishkan into Shiloh, and it stayed there for 360, I think 369 years, 369? For like 369 years, it stayed in Shiloh as like a temporary place before it moved to a couple other places, Nov and Givon, all those places, but stayed in Shiloh for a long time. So now, Moshe Rabbeinu's original Mizbeach, it seems everyone is clear that was made out of wood. It was covered in nechoshes. It was called the Mizbeach and nechoshes. That was made out of wood. Now the question is, the Mizbeach that they had in Shiloh, what was that made out of? The Gemara says, Omer of Hudam Marav Mizbeach shel Shiloh shel Avanim Haya. It was made out of stone. The Tanya, if you learned in a brayso, Lozav and Yaakov Omer Ma Tamalomar Avanim Avanim, Avanim. Why does the pasuk say Avanim 3 times? So these are 3 different psukim. One place it says the im mizbach Avanim tasali. Next one says Banisali Sham Mizbach Hashem Lekecha Mizbach Avanim. And the third pasuk says Avanim Shlemos Tivnus Mizbach. So the pasuk refers to Mizbach 3 times as made out of stone. What are these 3 different references to stone in the psukim? One refers to Mizbeach that was made in Shiloh. One is the Mizbeach of Nov and Givon, even though there were 2 different places, they're considered to be one. And the last one is the Beis Olamim, and the last one is the Mizbeach that was built inside the Mikdash that lasted as long as the Beis Mikdash was there. So now, simple statement that the Mizbeach that they had in Shiloh was made out of stone. Masar Rav Acha bar Ami asked the following question. It says, Eish sheyarda min hashemayim b'mei Moshe. The Eish, the fire that came down on the Mizbeach in times of Moshe, the pasuk says Moshe Rabbeinu was davening, Yirason shetisha shkinastu b'masi yedenu, Kadosh Baruch Hu, we built this beautiful thing. There's the whole drama that happened. First it wasn't coming down, but ultimately the fire came down from Shemayim, and it stayed on top of Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach. So we learned the Eish sheyarda min hashemayim b'mei Moshe, the fire that came down from Shemayim in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, lo nistalka mi'al ha-Mizbeach nechoshes, did not leave the top of the Mizbeach nechoshes, ella b'mei Shlomo, until the days of Shlomo. V'eish sheyarda b'mei Shlomo, lo nistalka ad sheba Menashe v'silka. The fire that came down in the times of Shlomo stayed there until Menashe ultimately destroyed the Mizbeach. But what's the point over here? If you're telling me that it's true, that the Mizbeach that was built in Shiloh after 14 years was made out of stone, meikarahu distalically. Clearly, the fire had to be transferred from one place to the next. So the fire left Mizbeach and Achoshes, and a new fire was built or was lit on top of this new Mizbeach of Avanim. Mikar hu distalically. The Gemara says, "Hudamer Rav Nasan." That must be going according to Rav Nasan. The Tanya Rav Nasan Omer Mizbeach shel Shiloh shel Nechoshes haya. The Mizbeach of Shiloh was made out of Choshes, and Chalol, it was hollow, umali avanim, and was filled up with stones. So that's the first teretz. The first teretz says, it seems like there's 2 different opinions. We're not 100% sure what it's made out of. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak answers this differently. He says, Milo Nistalka, what does it mean when it says that the fire that came down in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu never left? It means Lo Nistalka Livatala. It wasn't, Rashi says, it means Shetehei Betela Mimizbeach Hanachoshes Legamri. It didn't become entirely extinguished. So what was it? In other words, he's saying it was nostalgic, it did go away, but not entirely. So what does this mean? What does that mean? Rabbanan Amri Shaviva Havi Mishta. So what this means is, the Karashi Kshayu Maktirin Al Shalavanim Hayu Zikim Ulahavos Yotzos Me'esh Shamayim Shamazbeach Hanachoshes Shalmoshe Sha'af Hu Munach Sham. So that's something fascinating. The Gemara comes with this fascinating idea. They didn't just throw out the Mizbeach that Moshe Rabbeinu built. Moshe Rabbeinu built this Mizbeach of Nechoshes, and they kept it. So now they built a new Mizbeach made out of stone, and that became the primary Mizbeach that they would use, but they left Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach standing right next to it. So now what would happen? they bring karbanos on top of this brand new mizbeach made out of stone, and the fire from the old mizbeach would shoot off. They'd have like these little sparks that would shoot off from the old mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu, and it would light the fire on the new mizbeach. So that's what it means. It was, to a certain extent, it was nostalgic because it wasn't really used anymore. But lo nostalgia, it never went away because Moshe Rabbeinu's fire was always there. That mizbeach was always there, and fire would shoot from the mizbeach and the choshes onto the new mizbeach shalavanu. Amar Papa says, "Ushpizahava." The fire was kind of like a guest. Ushpizahava nakat. V'zimnin hacha, v'zimnin hacha. The fire would jump from one place to the next. The bottom line is, it's true. They had a brand new mizbeach. It was made out of stone. They built a new mizbeach because the old one was maybe too small. And ultimately, they built a new mizbeach, and the fire stayed on the old mizbeach. The old mizbeach stayed right there adjacent to the new mizbeach. Some say fire would go ahead and jump from one to the next, and according to the way that Rabbi explains it, it was a guest that sometimes went here, sometimes went there. Okay. Tanan Asam. Another point about the Mizbeach. During the ultimate, the Galus, the exile, Hasifol of Dalad Amis min Adarim, the Dalad Amis min Hamayrav. What they did was, they made an addition. They added an addition to the Mizbeach. We've talked about the additions to Mizbeach for quite some time. So here the Gemara says what happened, they added on 4 Amis in the west side and 4 Amis in the south side, Kemin Gamma, like a gamma. What's a gamma? A gamma is a Greek letter. Rashi tells us it's like a chaf, or I guess in the alphabet it would be like an L. So it was a right angle. So when they added on to the Mizbeach, they didn't add on to all 4 sides. They added on 4 Amas on the south side. I was about to say the left side. I guess it depends which side you're standing on. But so they added on south side and on to the west side. Kimin Gamma, like a right angle, like an L. So they picked up the size from 28 amos to 32 amos by adding on 4 amos on each side. The Gemara asks, my time, why did they do this? Why did they make the Mizbeach bigger? My time, Amr Yosef Mishum Delo Safek. There wasn't enough room on the Mizbeach, so they made a bigger one. So Amr Lei Abaya, he said, hold on a second. Hashta Mikdash Rishon. During the Beis HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash, T'chsiv Be Yehuda v'Yisrael Rabim K'chol Ashar Asvat Hayam. So in the first Beis HaMikdash, the Mizbeach was 28 by 28, and that was enough. And the pasuk describes the people who were there as K'chol Ashar Asvat Hayam, like the sand of the sea. In other words, not countable. And still, the 28 by 28 was sufficient. And Sapek, Mikdash Sheni, when it came to the second Beis HaMikdash, where they added on this extra L, this extra right angle of 4 amos on the south and 4 amos in the west. Look what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, "T'chsiv Bei Kol Hakol Ke'echad Arba Riboy." The entire Kahal was about 4,000. The rest of the pasuk gives the exact amount of people that were there. It says Ke'echad Arba Riboy Alpayim Shloish Meos V'Shishim. So it's 42,360 people. That's not Kechol Ashar Svasayam. That's a countable number, and it's much less. So why is it by the first Beis HaMikdash they had this 28 by 28 Mizbeach, and it was enough? But now you have much fewer people when it comes to the second Beis HaMikdash, and you have to make an addition. The Gemara answers, Amar Lei, Hasam Eishal Shemayim Misayasa. The first Beis HaMikdash, it was supernatural. They relied on the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent this Eish Min HaShemayim to consume the karbanos, and karbanos burnt at a rapid pace, much quicker than normal. The second Beis HaMikdash, I guess they didn't want to rely on an ace happening. They said we have to make our shtadlus, make a bigger mizbeach, because we can't rely on the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to send us heavenly fires to consume our karbanos, and therefore they made a bigger mizbeach. They included their shtadlus, their ultimate work to be able to make sure that the karbanos will be eaten or will be properly burnt. Hacha ein eish hashemayim misayasa. And the second Beis Hamikdash, they couldn't rely on the eish of Shemayim, the divine fire of helping them consume all the kavanas. Kiyasa Ravin, when Ravin came, he gave another explanation as to why they made it in addition to the Mizbeach. Amar Shimon Pazi Shemishum Bar Kapara, he said Shitin Hosifu, they added on these Shitin. These Shitin were pipes. In other words, what was this? Look at Rashi. Rashi, it's about 7-8 lines from the bottom. Shitin Hosifu. Karen Maravis Deromis Hosifu Lemashcha Ledarom Ulamarav. They added on to pull the Mizbeach to the south and to the west. Why Shesham Hayu Menaschin Nisachim Kedarmina B'Masnisa. They would have these wine libations they'd pour on the Mizbeach. Come on, we make Shlomo Hayu Kimin Bar Karoi Eitz the Mizbeach. In the days of Shlomo HaMelech, they had this, I guess, this little pit that was dug next to the Mizbeach. Ba'osa Zavis layered Hanasachim betocho v'yardim in Mizbeach the Ritz b'shosas in Sham. During the first Beis Hamikdash, they would pour the wine on top of the Mizbeach. Where would the wine go? It would spill over the side, run down the wall of the Mizbeach, and then it would be absorbed into this pit at the bottom on the floor. The second Beis Hamikdash, v'heim kaltu osa habar l'tocha mizbeach v'asu nekavim kinegdan barosh mizbeach leir nesachim masham. What would they do? They stretched out the mizbeach to cover this area, and they drilled a pipe inside the mizbeach, and they'd pour the wine libations directly into this pipe or to this funnel, and it would go straight through the mizbeach into these ditches. So in other words, instead of having wine spilling over the side of the Mizbeach and running down the Mizbeach and then going onto the floor and being absorbed into the floor there, they stretched out the Mizbeach to cover that area, and they drilled all the way through the Mizbeach. Like this, when they poured the wine libations on the Mizbeach, it went straight down through this pipe, right into that ditch, and was absorbed into the ground, and didn't make this huge mess anymore inside the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara wants to know, Meikara Savar, by the first Beis Hamikdash, what do they think? They thought Mizbach Adama, when the pasuk says the Mizbach has been made out of earth, Shehu Atum Be'adam, it's got to be completely 100% clogged up with dirt. You can't have a hole running through the middle. Therefore, they didn't do that. However, Lebesov Savar, at the end, during the second Beis Hamikdash, what did they think? Shtiya Kiachila. Drinking is like eating. We have this halach with regard to people at Shtiya Kiachila, but they learned that Mizbach as well, the same thing is true. Just like a Mizbeach consumes karbanos by eating it, it's called the fire goes ahead and consumes it. The fire, it's called misachel. It eats it and it's digested on top of the Mizbeach. Same thing is true when it comes to the wine libations. The Mizbeach is able to drink the wine, and therefore you can have a hole where the wine goes to the Mizbeach. Umay Mizbeach Adam. What do you do about the fact that it says Mizbeach has to be filled up with dirt? Shehu mechuber ba'adama. It doesn't mean it has to be completely filled up with dirt, that there can't be any hole throughout the middle. It has to be that it's connected to the ground. Shlo yivnenu lo yagav, and keep him lo yagav mechilis. You can't build it on top of any type of platform or on top of any type of tunnels. So they changed their understanding from the first Beis Hamikdash to the second Beis Hamikdash, where in the first Beis Hamikdash they understood the Mizbeach has to be completely filled up without any hole through the Mizbeach, and therefore they did the Nesachim, the wine libations, pouring it on top, allowing the wine to drip down the side. The second Beis Hamikdash, they relearned the Psukim, they came up with a new drush and said, no, that's not what it means. Mizbeach Hatama doesn't mean it's completely full without any holes in it. What it means is, it's connected to the ground, it's not on top of any platforms or on top of any tunnels. So now, they came up with this brilliant idea. Instead of having wine spilling all over the place, running down the side of the Mizbeach, they just made an addition to the Mizbeach, not because the Mizbeach wasn't big enough. It can't be the Mizbeach wasn't big enough, because we know there were much fewer people during Bayis Sheni than there were during Bayis Rishon. So what the Mizbeach was perfectly the right size, but they added onto the Mizbeach 4 amos to the west and 4 amos to the south. It's like this, the Mizbeach went further without moving the Mizbeach to cover over that area where the wine would be absorbed into the ground or into the stream. Like this, able to pour the wine directly onto the Mizbeach and go straight through this chute all the way down to the ground, and everything was much neater and cleaner during the second Beis Hamikdash. We'll stop here. Mitzvah Shalom, pick up at the top tomorrow. Have a wonderful day and have a great Shabbos.